In this unit, we're going to focus on formal fallacies. Formal fallacies are difficult. If you've already started looking at the book and studying the material, you're going to realize that this is probably the hardest chapter that you will cover in this course. And I understand that because we don't normally think in the terms that we discuss in this chapter. Formal fallacies are fallacies that attack the form of an argument. It's not about the content. We love the fallacies that have to do with content. We call those informal fallacies. But the fallacies of the structure of the arguments, they're hard to grasp sometimes. There are 6 major fallacies that we need to review. The first 3 are very similar because they make the same mistake, but they make the same mistake with 3 different parts of the syllogism. Now, I suggest you review the 6 rules covered in chapter 6 because this is going to be a repetition of that and an exposition that's going to expand a little bit on those 6 rules. So review those before you go on and study this module. Formal fallacies of categorical syllogisms, 6 different types. The first 3, illicit major, illicit minor, and illicit middle, all make the mistake of coming to a conclusion about an entire group without ever addressing the entire group in the argument itself. The major term is distributed in the conclusion, but not in the premises. And you cannot logically conclude anything about the whole group from something you only know about part of the group. If I say, for example, an argument as follows: 5 boys in my first period class were very disruptive. 3 girls in my first period class were very disruptive. Therefore, my first period class was very disruptive. Therefore, boys are more disruptive than girls. Think about that for a minute. In the argument, I talk about 5 boys, not all the boys. So how can I conclude that all boys are more disruptive than girls? You can never conclude something about the whole group where you've only addressed a part of the group. That's the fallacy of illicit major. Illicit minor does the same thing, but with a minor term in the argument. In the argument we just presented, only 3 girls were disruptive. Is it fair for me to say that girls are less disruptive than boys? No, because in the argument I only speak of 3 girls, not all of the girls of the class. You cannot conclude something about the whole group when you've only addressed a part of the group in your argument. That's what those 2 fallacies do. And the illicit middle does the exact same thing for the middle term. The middle term is undistributed in the argument, but then when you come to the conclusion, it becomes a distributed argument. So those 3 fallacies are easy to understand. When you understand one of them, it's just applying that to the different terms. Now the 4th fallacy that we need to look at is a little more complicated. That's called the 4-term fallacy. This is a fallacy where we introduce an extra term to the argument. When there are more than 3 terms in an argument, you have a problem. A typical 3-line syllogism can only have 3 unique terms. You have the major term, the minor term, and the term that connects them both. When I say all men are mortal, I've introduced 2 terms in the argument, men and mortal. In my next line, I say Socrates is a man, I introduced a 3rd element, Socrates. Now, man is not a new word. It's already in the first term, in the first premise. So now we have the 3 terms of our argument, and my conclusion, Socrates is mortal, is perfectly in line because it includes the major and the minor premises of the argument. What happens with a 4-term argument is that you take the connecting word and use it differently in each premise. Let me give you a funny example. Synthetic sugars are bad for your body. Your girlfriend is bad. Therefore, your girlfriend is a synthetic sugar. Obviously a fallacious argument. But what makes it fallacious is that the word bad that should be connecting the 2 terms, the major and the minor term, in fact separates them. Because synthetic sugar being bad is bad in the sense that it's something you should not consume. Whereas your girlfriend being bad is bad in the sense of moral reprehensibility. So there's two different terms. Bad means two different things. Now we have four terms in this argument, and it just doesn't work that way. Now, what's the fifth kind of argument? The fifth kind of argument falls in the category of hypothetical syllogisms. And that is when we deny the antecedent. Now, if you remember the hypothetical syllogisms, the if-then arguments, the antecedent is what sets up the argument. If conditions A apply, then conditions B will apply. So when you deny condition A, you've lost your argument. Nothing can follow from nothing. So denying the antecedent is removing that if section and then still considering that your argument is valid. For example, if I say the following argument, if Joe studies, he will pass the test. Joe did not study, therefore Joe did not pass the test. It sounds like a valid argument, but it's not. It's committing this fallacy. Why is that the case? Because you're denying the antecedent. George could have passed the test without studying. He didn't have to study to pass the test. If he studied, he's going to pass it. But if he didn't study, can he still pass it? Absolutely. Maybe he knows the material. Maybe he cheats and copies from somebody else. Maybe he didn't even need to study. So you cannot take away the if statement and then assume that the then statement can or cannot happen. When you remove the antecedent, you've lost your argument altogether. There's nothing to follow from nothing. And the last argument that we need to consider, or the last mistake, is affirming the consequent. That is when you have an if-then statement and you affirm the then statement, it doesn't necessarily follow that the antecedent is going to work. Affirming the consequent doesn't necessarily affirm the antecedent. The consequent may be the result of another antecedent. It doesn't always work that way. Another funny example. If the Apostle Paul is shot in a drive-by shooting, then the Apostle Paul is dead. Now, if we commit this fallacy, we go on to say in the second premise, the Apostle Paul is dead. You affirm the consequent. Therefore, the conclusion would be the Apostle Paul was shot in a drive-by shooting. Well, there were no cars and no guns, so it's kind of hard to say that he was shot in a drive-by shooting unless a camel came by and they were shooting darts or something. It just doesn't work. The deal is he could be dead from many causes. Affirming the consequent does not mean the antecedent works. I know this is complicated. Please do the exercises at the end of this chapter, review the module, listen to the PowerPoint lecture, and hopefully after you've spent some time in this unit, you will be able to master these fallacies and not commit them when you argue or allow others to commit them in arguing with you. This is Dr. Juan Valdez of Academy of Hope, and that wraps up Formal Fallacies.